What's up everyone? I hope you've all been doing great. My name is Veronica. If you're new here to my channel, I talk about all things fashion and sustainability. So today we're going to be talking about patchwork. I will be teaching you guys everything you need to know about patchwork, how to work with different types of fabrics and different techniques. Patchwork is basically just taking a bunch of scrap pieces of fabric and piecing them together to create a whole piece of fabric. There are so many different ways you can do it. You can combine different colors, different textiles. It's really up to you, and there are no set rules in my opinion on how to patchwork. I am a zero waste brand, so I love to patchwork to really use up every single piece of scrap fabric that I have. Every time I create a large piece and I have leftover scraps, I keep them all so that I can do scrap projects later on, which will be the next video on what to do with all of your scraps. And now that you have a basic understanding of what patchwork is, let's just get straight into the video.
The first thing you always want to do is identify the grain line on your fabric. All woven fabrics have a straight grain line, cross grain, also referred to as a raw edge, a selvage, and a bias. To identify your straight grain on your fabric, it will be parallel to the selvage edge. Typically, when you're cutting out your pattern pieces, you want to align them parallel to the selvage edge so they end up on the straight grain line. The straight grain never has any stretch, but the cross grain line tends to have a little more give, and if the fabric is woven with a spandex, then the cross grain can have a lot more stretch, making it a two-way stretch fabric. The bias line always has the most stretch, even if the fabric has no spandex woven into it. You would typically cut pattern pieces aligned with the bias when you want your design to be more draped and flowy. Knit fabrics are instead knitted together using one continuous thread. This way, the fabric can stretch in every direction, making it a four-way stretch fabric. Stretch fabrics are a more popular material to use for patchwork since you can use the scraps in any which way and you don't have to align your grain lines, but we'll get more into that later. But since the fabric can stretch, you want to avoid using a straight stitch whenever you're sewing your fabric together on a sewing machine. It can restrict the fabric and your threads can tend to break. You instead want to use an overlock machine, also called a serger, and if you don't have a serger, you can use a zigzag stitch on your home machine so the seams can stretch with the fabric. Leather is also a great alternative to use for patchwork since it has no kind of grain line or cross grain, since it is a hide and not an actual piece of fabric. And this way you can use the material in any direction and you don't have to follow any grain lines. In this case, we are working with scrap pieces of fabric, so we can't easily identify where the selvage is, and we might not be able to easily find the straight grain or the cross grain. So I like to tug around on my scraps until I find the tightest area, which is the straight grain, and you can then mark it with a line on the wrong side of your fabric so you can remember that that is your straight grain. I have a lot of silk scraps, so I'll be using that as my example today, but I recommend using a medium weight fabric or a knit to start out. I'm going to first create my pattern I'm going to be following, and I'll be making a triangle headscarf. I cut out a piece of paper to be 35 inches wide, folded it in half, and measured from the edge to the middle of the paper until I got 25 inches. I drew a line connecting the ends and I cut it out. The goal of patchwork is to place pieces of fabric together until you create one whole piece. So first I'm going to organize my scraps and find the largest pieces to use first and then fill in with the smaller ones. I'm going to continuously tug on my scraps until I can identify where the straight grain is. This is where knowing how to identify the grain line is important. You want to make sewing the pieces together as easy as possible, so I like to cut off any L-shaped edges and make them straight so I can connect each piece together easily. For this headscarf, I want the bottom edge to be on the bias so it can stretch around my head easily. So I'm going to place the bias line on the edge of my pattern and adjust the pieces as needed, and cut off any excess fabric along the pattern edges. You want to remember to leave excess fabric so you can have seam allowance whenever you're sewing each of your edges together, so whenever you sew it all together, your patchwork piece matches up with your pattern. on this piece of fabric on that straight edge, it ended up being a little bit on the bias instead of completely on the straight grain. So in this kind of situation, you want to make sure that one side is on the straight grain so that it can prevent the other edge from stretching. If you align two bias edges together, the fabric can tend to stretch and your seam will end up all lumpy. Once I placed all of my fabric pieces on top of my patterns and cut off all the excess fabric, I pinned them all together and now you're ready to sew. Another way to patchwork is to place the fabric on top of a piece of fabric, in this case a pair of jeans. I have this pair of boyfriend jeans and the holes just keep getting bigger, so I want to cover them up. I first cut off all the extra strings on the pants and then cut up some fabric scraps into squares. I arranged them all on the pants how I liked and pinned them into place. You can machine sew all of the patchwork onto the pants. I prefer to hand sew because machine sewing tends to get difficult. These are just two patchwork techniques that you can use and apply to many different designs. These are some patchwork garments I've made from old jeans and jean jackets using both methods of patchwork. I've also made this leather jacket by taking apart old leather jackets and piecing them together. Here's some inspiration of different things you can patchwork with different kinds of fabrics.
I hope you guys liked today's video and you learned something new. This is a technique that anyone can do and can be applied in so many different ways. It's just about your personal style and your own take on it. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.